Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here to present some of the findings that we did in the ESPON SUPER project. It's a super acronym, and it stands for Sustainable Urbanization Practices in European Regions. And I'm going to not really focus on the practices part, which we also researched, but I want to give just a broad overview of the developments that happened in Europe, and specifically on the idea of land take and sprawl, what we were asked to research. So at the very beginning, I don't like the term land take myself. And I know that the European Union has chosen this as its preferred term in its goal of achieving zero net land take by 2050. But I found it, it sounds like it's unsustainable right from the get-go. When you talk about land being taken, it doesn't sound like we're asking for it. It doesn't sound like you have any right to it. But somebody has their microphone on, unfortunately. So, and then of course you can ask, is this really true? Land doesn't disappear. It's really not being taken. It's being changed from one use to another use. And of course, it's being taken for a reason. People have to live somewhere, businesses have to locate somewhere. And even the idea of this being unsustainable, you can question that. There are forms of agriculture which are also more polluting than some forms of urban use. So I want to look at what is being converted exactly. So that is what we did in the SUPER project. When it's going from a non-urban use to urban use, we call it urbanization rather than land take. So how much of this urbanization is occurring in Europe? Well, more than zero. If you look per day, we have about 250 football fields. Well, in hectares, that's more like 180 hectares being converted from non-urban to urban per day. And I circled this part because it's urban green. So here you also get a bit penalized by converting, let's say, agriculture into a park. So that's one caveat to bear in mind, especially Netherlands and UK have a lot of urban green in their conversion. But still, a significant amount, more than zero, is being converted. And we did all sorts of maps and figures, because ESPON loves maps, about which regions are converting the most, where it's converting from, mainly agriculture, a little bit of nature, and then what kind of urban use is being produced. If you look over time, you see that in the 3 periods that we had access to through the Korean land cover data, that each successive period, there was less of this urbanization. So it seems to be slowing down. So if you're in the mindset that more urbanization is unsustainable, then it seems to be going in the right direction. And if you zoom in at the country level, you also see that there are big differences. Of course, big countries are the ones who urbanize the most. Spain and France are ones on top. But they urbanize in different ways. Spain, you see a lot of construction sites, so you don't know if this is actually going to become urban or not. Sometimes these get abandoned if there's the economy doesn't push for it. And you see in the last period, Spain is much, much less. So it's going down. Many countries are going down, but a few are increasing. UK was one of them. Poland is another. And you also see differences in what type of what the land is converting to. So in Poland, you see a lot more industry than, let's say, France and Germany, which is more oriented towards housing. How do countries compare to each other on this indicator? Well, we've done various rankings, but I think one of the best ways is to just benchmark according to each other. So if you take things according to the European average, and look also in terms of per capita growth uh, rather than absolute growth, then you can maybe get a more or less of an idea of which areas are regions are outstripping urbanization, and which areas seem to be urbanizing more compactly. So if you look at the light red areas, those are areas where the growth is more of urban areas more than the population, and light blue is the opposite. So you've more growth in population relative to urbanization. So you could say somewhat compact. Now, I think some of the Belgians might be surprised about this. One of the reasons why you might be surprised about this is the quality of the data. While it's very good in the sense that it's comprehensive and covers the territory of Europe, if you zoom in, you see some problems with it. Not so much for the Netherlands. So I'm showing you here part of The Hague and Rotterdam area, where it more or less conforms to what we consider as urban. The black outside are mostly glass houses, which are considered agriculture. So, but look here to the north of Antwerp. There are some large areas which have very little real urban development according to global footprint data, which just measures whether a building is there. So it's been classified as urban, but there's not a whole lot built there. And if you zoom in, you see that, yes, there are quite a few things being built. And the consequence of this is if there are new buildings being built, like this photograph shows, it doesn't get registered as more urbanization because it's happening in an already existing urban area. So it seems like it's densification, even though the densities are extremely low. So that's one of the reasons why Belgium sometimes looks good on these measures. And there's also errors on the other side. This is to the east of Warsaw. And you see in this area, it's not been coded urban at all, but you do see buildings. So if you zoom in on this area and try to figure out what's going on there, yes, you see, this almost looks like the same area in Belgium in terms of density, but this has been classified as non-urban. So probably if more gets built here, it also isn't registered until maybe Corine registers it as urban, and then it shows as maybe sprawl or whatever. So I said the word sprawl, and that's another term that we don't prefer to use, because that's also, just like land take in our view, pejorative. So what we would like to do is talk about urban form. What shape do cities and urban areas take? And then you can measure it in different ways, rather than just focusing on this idea of sprawl, which is also notoriously difficult to get a handle on. So what did we do to try to come to terms with measuring urban shape, morphology? Well, what we did is we took every single NUTS3 region in Europe and basically used our eyes and asked ourselves, what do we see here in terms of urban structure? So on the left, you see one main region and a whole lot of tiny, tiny villages. On the right, you see two main regions and a lot of building along the roadways outside. And so what we said is that the first one, we would give a 1 because you see one main region, and then the rest seems quite diffuse. So we give a ranking of 4. And on the right, two main regions, which we call the main structure, and then the rest is quite diffuse. So we classified every region in Europe according to this method, and then we can produce maps of what we saw. So this is not, to a certain extent, a subjective, because it was the way we interpreted it visually, rather than, let's say, machine learning, an algorithm. But still, it's interesting to see that the most, let's say, common type of urban construction is urban form is polycentric, and in the substructure, it's tending more towards polycentric diffuse, which isn't so surprising. And it's also interesting to see the differences within Europe. So I guess if you were to look for urban sprawl, you would say, well, that's really diffuse urbanization. And because sprawl is something that changes over time, it would be something like this, where you would just look at what changed in the 2000 to 2000 period. And if you look at that and saw how cities were growing morphologically, you see a lot of that really diffuse development in Poland, for example. So using this, we decided to create 3 scenarios for the future. And the first one is, what would happen if the cities and the urban regions continue to develop, but according to compact development? The other extreme is diffuse, and the one in the middle is the polycentric. And what we did is we fed this into a land allocation model, and this goes every 5 years and allocates a set amount of demand to space, to areas which is seen as the most suitable area to develop. And we were able to tweak the model to make it conform to our 3 different scenarios. So here's the results between the 2 main scenarios, compact versus diffuse. You see pretty much nothing at the European level, so you have to zoom in to see the differences. And so here we have compact Belgium. You see in the darker red is areas that are just being built in the scenario between now and 2050. And here's the diffuse Belgium. And this is more spread out, but you also see big differences in the final urban form. And do the same with Germany here. Just a bit between compact and diffuse, going back and forth. Here's one in Vilnius. You can zoom in this far anywhere in Europe. So I want to say a couple caveats. One is that this isn't the future that we're predicting, and it's a very crude model, of course, because it just takes demand and allocates it according to what it thinks is the most logical place. It doesn't have much in the way of policy, so any local, national policies aren't in there. And mainly it looks at suitability in terms of if it's already near an urban area or has good road access. So this is to be taken with a grain of salt. But if you run the model and you look at the different scenarios, you can also compare scenarios according to how concentrated the population will be, or how much extra land is being produced and in which regions. And then to assess the scenario, whether or not this is sustainable, we created a framework where we did a literature review trying to find any references according to whether or not, let's say, compact development versus sprawl, many times it's called sprawl, and polycentric development was scoring well or not on these indicators. And so this was done on, a lot of it was planning literature, so there was probably a bias there. We also consulted Paul Cheshire's stuff, so he's a part of this pluses and minuses in here as well. So coming to the end of this idea of what's going on in Europe from a very bird's eye view, first thing that we see is between 2000 and 2018, there is no zero net land take, but it seems to be declining. So this urbanization is going down. And if you look at the urban form, you do see some changes over this period, but not very much. So much of the urban form that you see is inherited from before this period. And yeah, whether or not this is sustainable or not, that also depends on your definition. So I think just having a one dimensional indicator like no net land take might be not the best way forward. Looking at the future, why make scenarios? Now, we think that it can also help to initiate a discussion with politicians and other people about these areas which are getting urbanized in each scenario, are these places that we would rather keep open? Yes or no? Also, whether or not the final picture is something we want, yes or no? And maybe thinking about ideas about public services, car use, that sort of thing, whether or not this is something that we desire or not. And ultimately, well, we're scientists, not politicians, and the politicians have to decide on this. So we can just illustrate possible futures, but the actual decision has to be done by others. And they have to create, let's say, interventions. If they don't like the way things are happening and they want to change things, we created this handbook. We call it a guide, where we discuss different interventions that you can choose from. And we did this by surveying the literature, doing an online survey, and basically bothering everyone we knew to try to get examples. And in the end, we got more than 200 examples of interventions and some idea of whether or not they work and whether or not they're sustainable. And we provide this online. So if you go to the Super website, you can download our intervention database and use it for whatever you want. And here's some examples. For example, I think Malta is very interesting. They just said, rule to allow landowners to add an extra floor to a building, just straight across the board. Well, of course, we'll probably get very quick results. And Luxembourg took a maybe more soft approach by trying to identify areas in the urban fabric which seem to be open and buildable, and then contact the landowners and say, hey, why don't you build here? And in Reggio Emilia in Italy, people who had land that was zoned urban and had to pay higher taxes on it, but didn't have any intents to urbanize it, they were allowed to dezone it and get a lower tax burden. So these are a few of the 200 interventions that we have. If you're asking yourselves, what is a good intervention? Unfortunately, we can't answer that. We did some statistical analysis on this and came up with basically nothing. It turns out that the legal rules or soft policies or subsidies, all these types of things, we have examples where they seem to work and also examples where they don't seem to work. And when you look at the explanations why they do or don't work, there you see some commonalities. And unfortunately, it's the ones that you always hear. Coordination is good, collaboration is good, long-term perspective is good. That helps create a successful intervention. So yeah, not so surprising results there. But I guess good news is you have your choice of different types of interventions, and it's not necessarily is worse than, let's say, subsidies. We also did 11 case studies, and I'm not going to go into detail here with this because I think other people will go into more in depth what's happening on the ground. But just to give you a couple examples, in Spain, it was quite interesting that they started with an intervention around Valencia, kind of like a greenbelt idea, which was very ecologically oriented. And that failed to raise enough support. So once they broadened the goals to include economic goals and social goals, it became more successful and more robust. And in Austria, that was one where various municipalities came together and agreed to a common plan. And we saw that this way they did it seemed to work out quite well. And it was a lot of getting to know each other and open communication channels back and forth. That seemed to work well in Austria. And then two, which I'm not going to go in detail because I see that others will do this. Germany, they have a 30 hectare per day target. So that's similar to what the European Union is trying to do. And the Switzerland has a pretty rigid or far-reaching law against sprawl. And I think one of the reasons why it's seen as effective is because it was also enacted by a political referendum. So it has that let's say, political support. So getting to the end, here, when we ask people in our online surveys and in our case studies about the impacts, so basically judging what they said that they do see that these interventions have influence on land use developments. We weren't able to make that link looking at the actual land use change data, but they said that it would have been worse if we hadn't done intervention. And I think another takeaway here is to think that if Europe is one gigantic laboratory where everyone's trying to do something to steer urbanization in their own way, you can see it as a laboratory, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. You say, well, we get to know these different examples, take a look at our guide, look at the intervention database if you want, and try to become inspired by this. Don't try to just transfer it to your country, because that will probably not work very well, but just think, hey, that might be possible. And one thing that we did find, which I guess going against that, it seemed to work many times, was this idea of strategies and visions, that if you're able to set out a long-term goal, they could make short-term measures seem more logical, and people accept it a bit more. So that was my talk. Thank you very much.